Hey everybody, this is Richard Ruane, and we have 0 viewers right now, so we'll see if we get people joining us. Otherwise, this will be recorded and posted up, and will be a great chance for us three to talk towards the end of Gauntlet Con in our sleep-deprived, overexcited, brain-drenched states. Coming to you live from We Work in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, New York. I am Richard Ruane. And I am joined by two of my favorite DIY OSR people in the Gauntlet community. We really wanted to have kind of a Gauntlet community panel, not like an OSR experts panel, but just a panel to talk for Gauntlet community members to talk about OSR adjacent and OSR related projects they're working on, whether that's personal projects for games they're running or things they might want to publish in the big time or small time. So I am going to turn it over and let Maria Rivera introduce herself.
I am sad that I have to start, but okay. I am Maria Rivera, as Richard said. I am awkward. Sorry. So I've been in last year's OSR panel as well, and I think I've learned more since the last year, like way more. So I hope that this panel won't be like, okay, it depends, but I really don't know. I think I would know more at this point about how OSR. Personal projects, I theory craft. Oh, Rich, you're muted.
We'll talk about personal projects in just a moment.
Oh, right.
Yep. But just wanted to let people, and Maria, where are you coming from? Or where are you located right now? Is yours?
Oh, both are the same answer. It's Puerto Rico.
Awesome. And from the opposite side in a different ocean, we have Kyle Thompson. Kyle, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I am Kyle Thompson. I am a member of the Gauntlet community, have been for about a year now, a little over. And I am a bit of a game designer, a bit of a GM, and I'm coming to you from Kobe, Japan.
Nice. All right, and we are also joined by the omnicompetent River Williamson, who is handling our sort of questions. So if you have questions, please post them on YouTube, post them on our GauntletCon panel channel, and we'll get them kind of posted and up. So I want to start looking at our agenda, but briefly just sort of talking about when we say old school games, I think all of us kind of come from sort of a different perspective on what might be OSR or what might not be. And instead of like trying to like derail an entire panel about hacking OSR games, I just wanted everybody to kind of give their perspective on what they're seeing as OSR when they talk about getting excited by OSR. What kind of games and what kind of adventure scenarios are they seeing that are getting them excited? And what kind of qualities about those are the things that are like kind of wanting to get you interested in hacking? And I'll start. I think one of the first OSR systems I've encountered was the old Moldvay Red Box, and then the Tim Cook, the Zeb Cook blue box. I sounded like an idiot just there. I know what I'm talking about, which OSR people call the BX. It's cloned brilliantly by both Labyrinth Lord and BX Essentials. And that, for a lot of reasons that I'll mention later as we talk about hacking, I would, has a lot of sort of tools and techniques, and certainly simplified so much of what was kind of chaotic in the early Gary Gygax, Dave Arneson D&D, and then just became excessively rigid or at least for me, excessively rigid in the Gary Gygax AD&D. And then later kind of coming back and getting excited by games like Dungeon Crawl Classics and Freebooters on the Frontier, World of Dungeons, and the Black Hack, and several games in sort of that kind of the Black Hack family. And then I'll reverse and let Kyle start this time. Kyle, for you, what games and scenarios do you think of when you say OSR, and kind of what gets you excited about them?
Yeah, so I think it's really like, of course, the BX related modules to start with, and then like the Osric stuff, and like anything connected to like Labyrinth Lord, Lamentations of the Flame Princess, all that kind of stuff. It definitely is OSR. But actually, where I got started with OSR was the Indie Hack. That was my first OSR game I ever played. And then I moved on to playing World of Dungeons with the co-host of Fear of Black Dragon, Tom, and played a pretty long campaign of Wodu with him, and got to try out a lot of different modules, stuff like Slumbering Ursine Dunes, a lot of sort of stuff they've covered on the show. And then I think there's sort of, there's the things you've mentioned, and then there's sort of a broader family of games that you might consider to be OSR. So, for example, things like maybe Cyberpunk 2020, maybe like early editions of Mech Warrior, maybe also things like the Mecha Hack, right? Like kind of genre bending games that, or even Stars Without Number, right? Yeah. So genre bending games that kind of move out of the classic fantasy mode and try to apply some of the same mechanics in different genres. So I have a very expansive definition of the OSR, I think.
Wonderful. And then Maria, who is the godbound deity of the OSR, why don't you talk about sort of your sort of introduction and sort of what games you think of, or you like kind of use as a starting place for hacking as you get to as you talk about the OSR.
So I really like that segue that Kyle said about how because I think when I think of OSR, I think like Godbound has OSR mechanics, definitely, but Wodu has a more OSR feel, and that's a hot take, I think. and I think that when someone asks me about OSR, I'm more excited about hacking because I am a hacker by nature. I like even when I was starting with RPGs, I was like making character sheets for something that was in my mind that would probably never work. But still, I think of the OSR as anything that tries to emulate something older in any way. Like I said, Godbound versus Wodu. And speaking of Wodu, I have played with the other co-host of the Fear of a Black Dragon, Jason Cordova. So my experience is similar but not the same to Kyle. As far as non-D&D OSR, that's I lean towards Troika, and I'm still new-ish at OSR, so I'm still exploring some OSR games.
So that was a great transition, Maria, because I think the next question I would like to just hear from you guys is it's a weird thing because I have no desire to build or even repair my own computer, much less change the oil in my own car. But if you show me a game that's sort of built along OSR lines, I really want to get out, and it could be something perfect. And my first read through, I could be like, I love this system. I don't want to change anything. And then 10 minutes after I put it down, I'm like, let's get out the magic system wrench and see if we can maybe add some new classes and then stuff like that. Why is hacking such kind of a compelling, interesting thing for you when it comes to OSR games? And I think I'll start with Maria. If you want to pass, then let's start with Maria though.
So sorry, I was a bit distracted. if I may reiterate, the question was
It's
what
kind of
excites me?
Yeah, what excites you about sort of hacking OSR games? Why of all the different kind of options you have in approaching, you decide you want to run a game in space, and you have lots of different options, but one of those options to hack an OSR game. What kind of gets you excited about hacking an OSR game? And you mentioned being kind of a hacker by nature, and so what is kind of hacking? What about hacking interests you or fascinates you about the OSR?
It's hilarious that you mentioned that because a few minutes before entering this panel, I was having this fascinating conversation about hacking PBTA versus hacking OSR. My conclusion from that is that OSR is slightly more accessible, at least in my opinion, than PBTA, at least hacking wise. And I'm not sure if Kyle agrees because of his feelings, but to me, it's slightly easier to work with OSR because of the whole D&D culture that's attached to it, and coming from a more trad background originally than PBTA.
Well, so there's just like, man, you go to the internet and there's just all these pieces of OSR games sort of just lying disassembled with sale tickers, that say 0 free on them.
Yeah.
So that's always like, oh, but I can just attach this and then detach this other thing.
Yeah,
Kyle,
pretty much.
what is it about that hacking that really kind of interests or fascinates you? What kind of has drawn you to kind of the OSR as a starting place for some of the work you're doing?
I think it's really this thing about in the OSR, there's really no presumption of completeness in games. That it's just like, oh, here's a skeleton, and now go do something with it. Because I think that in the D&D culture, there was so much DIY, like module design, dungeon design. There was so much interchangeability of modules. And that whole publishing model sort of created an ethos is very, very different from most indie games. And really, that's the thing that attracts me the most, because you see that sparseness in the design. It's expressed not only in how short OSR games usually are, but also in the sorts of mechanics and features that you find in OSR books, which are very easy to like add on to, recombine. They're all kind of built with this sort of sparseness or incompleteness in mind. The one that really grabbed me initially was making new classes in World of Dungeons. I just had a ton of fun with that. And I was like, okay, now that I've done this, I want to do more.
All right, thanks, guys.
If I may add to that,
Please.
I agree, and also like compared to PBTA, in my opinion, for a PBTA game to work, you kind of have to design the game from scratch. In OSR, you don't, which ties into that. The game doesn't have to be complete to be called a game. Richard, are you okay, Richard? You are muted.
Yeah, I was making sure I could see our list of questions. I know River's checking it, but I just like to see our wonderful viewers. Hi to wonderful Gauntlet people like Michael Barford, V. Hindro, Pashka, and then my screen is not scrolling, so I can't see everybody, but who are all just amazing people in and of their own right who do a lot of. V is a great game designer, and Rochelle, hi, and so many people from the community. So it's really great to see both the OSR and non-OSR people here, kind of talking about hacking with us. So thank you for joining us. And I really wanted to do something now that we've sort of kind of set out some definitions and just kind of talk about our own sort of projects we're involved in when hacking. And I'll start with my more nebulous project because it gives me a chance to give a shout out to Maria, because I have no idea where this project is going or what will become of it. But it's now been 2 different games that have been based on Beyond the Wall, and I'm kind of hoping it to kind of take that. Beyond the Wall is a wonderful OSR game that has a strong framing system around it to really sort of give it the sense of YA feel. It has very traditional OSR rules, but it uses a system of playbooks and scenario packs that are distinct from other things you might see in the OSR that give it a strong YA feel. So a few months ago, Maria was talking about how to do something very similar with a very dark fantasy Game of Thrones type feel. And my go-to response was, well, how would that work in Beyond the Wall? Because again, Beyond the Wall, because people were, well, how, get Game of Thrones and then you had some domain rules and it's all about ruling your land and controlling it. I'm like, well, in a traditional OSR game, that doesn't happen till you're like 9th level, and it's this long, complicated math problem. And it's a very interesting math problem for a lot of people, including me. It's a really fun math problem. And there's a lot of RP and storytelling that can kind of come out of that math problem, but it's a long, complicated math problem. And really, the lovable characters in Game of Thrones are people who find themselves in over their heads in politics on the day that the story starts. They're not, Jon Snow is not a 12th level character, and Arya Stark is not a 14th level assassin. They are all 0 level DCC characters who survive barely by the skin of their teeth the cruel arbitrariness of the world they're in. And so I really wanted something that sort of captured that. And I thought Beyond the Wall would be a really interesting place to start. And I was able to start that with the Gauntlet community, with people like Christo and Mark Causey, and I'm going to leave people out, Leandro and Maria, who gave me the idea to begin with, in a really fun 4-session game. And we picked a very similar thing back up at GauntletCon on Friday and had a great time. Running with an idea Mark Causey gave me, where the working title is Within the Walls. I'm not sure that will stay. I have no idea where this project's going. And then a much more short-term project that's hitting hard, that's actually scheduled for an upcoming codex, is Verdigris, which is coming up, which will be World of Dungeons based, but set in a dark shadow of the Emerald City. It's very much inspired by a Shauna McGuire novella or novelette called Emeralds to Emeralds and Dust to Dust. And if you know Shauna McGuire, she loves to do fantastical, hard-bitten war detectives. And in this case, the fantastical, hard-bitten war detective is a bitter, jaded Dorothy, still in the Emerald City. So that story inspired so much. And I'd love it to have sort of a spooky, dark, shadowy feel. So I'd love to hear, what are the two of you working on? And just for the sake of bouncing around, let's start with Kyle.
Sure, yeah. So I guess the kind of incontrovertibly OSR thing that I've done is the module to the Halls of the Stormlord that was in Codex. It was, I believe, the first published module for Macchiato Monsters. Yeah, that was a very traditionally OSR module, basically a straight up dungeon crawl. You go through, you climb a mountain, you go through a dwarven fortress, and you fight a giant lord. Lots of Norse mythology and stuff. It's very, very, very old school. And I did that because I wanted to get a feel for what the baseline could be for me with the OSR, right? Like something that would not look too out of place 30 years ago, right? So I incorporated some new ideas aside from those in Macchiato Monsters, which has a lot of interesting ideas in it on its own, such as including something similar to the engagement role from Blades in the Dark in the conclusion. So I give you these two big sections of normal OSR stuff, and then finally you end up with some indie game stuff at the end. So it's a shock, but yeah, that was a lot of fun to work on, and I find maybe the thing I enjoy the most in doing OSR work is probably the module design. It's super fun. It's so much fun to make. Making all those tables, making the locations, making the environmental storytelling, all that stuff is fantastic. The other thing that I have been working on is a mecha role-playing game called All Systems Nominal, which originally began as kind of a hack of World of Dungeons Turbo. And I was trying to produce something that was very brief, very slight, and would basically allow people to pick up their old BattleTech MechWarrior source books, or dig into some mecha franchise that they liked in a way similar to World of Dungeons with fantasy materials, right? Like, oh, maybe you like this module, but you don't necessarily want to run the game it was associated with. So why don't you try running this? Because I just saw in the wake of the release of BattleTech on PC this year, there were a lot of people saying, "Oh, I wish I could play, something like this, but I can't because there's just too much overhead to play BattleTech." Right? It's just all these 70s war game conventions in there. So that all started out very OSR. I think it's diverged significantly since then, based on playtesting experience. But I will talk about that later, maybe why I've gone in that direction. So I think I have one very sort of like clearly OSR product, and then one that started out there and has moved in a different direction since then.
And I'm going to shout out Maria Rivera as the idea generation machine, who has just brilliant ideas like 12 times before breakfast every day. Maria, what's kind of getting your attention right now? What are you most interested in working on, and what are some of the recent things you've been really interested in? I know you've talked about some of the stuff you've done with Knave. So
there's a drawback to having 12 ideas before breakfast, and it's like I don't even stick with any of them by the end of the day. So I have made one thing that's kinda OSR. It is a hack for the indie hack. It's called Hack Heroes and Crystal Kingdoms. Kyle played in it, so he has experience in it. Like last Gauntlet I ran it.
Yeah, that was my first OSR game I played as a player instead of a GM, so it was pretty cool.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, that was a thing. I'm still considering porting it to other systems that aren't indie hack. I was working on a Wodoo version that was sent to the back burner for several reasons. And I mentioned on Twitter this pun, Naively Default, because, of course, why not? So those aren't really projects per se, I don't think. Well, the Wodoo hack thing, maybe. It's just in the back burner. Naively Default is a joke that I may work on eventually. But nothing super like, this is the thing I'm doing and I'm gonna do it.
And you recently, though, you had some experience, I think, either kind of planning on or playing a game where you were kind of doing a mashup. I believe you did a Knave and BTW mashup. I'd love to hear about that.
All right. The thing about OSR is that, oh, I'm hearing myself twice. There's an echo. Where am I echoing? But okay, so the thing about OSR that I'm less excited about is how much you can die and how dying makes and how the lesser importance of the character. So I took Beyond the Wall playbooks because Beyond the Wall is great in the playbook aspect, but I don't think it's great mechanically other than that. So I took the playbooks and put them in Nave and tried to see what happens, and it was all right. Like uh, like uh, yeah, I can. It works well. It like straight up. I'm definitely gonna need some tweaks, and depending on the genre, I definitely need to do some tweaks. So yeah, that's and I was running that in a play by chat thing. So
Awesome.
that.
And you and I have both done a couple of Troika projects in the last year where we've
Oh, I
spent
never
lots of
finished
time,
mine.
spent lots of time just writing Troika backgrounds. And if you ever need to just relax and unwind, I recommend picking up a copy of Troika and then writing as many backgrounds as you can. There is the beautiful thing about Troika backgrounds is they're not balanced against each other at all. And Maria and I have had the joy of playing Troika with each other a couple of different times and having characters that were wildly unbalanced, but still somehow were able to share crazy amounts of screen time, which I think is something that's the OSR sort of started with, and people got concerned about balance. And I think one of the questions that the OSR kind of came back and asked the community is, why is balance so important? And is it possible to have fun without balance? And I think Troika answers that with a big resounding yes. And there are other OSR games out there too that have a firm yes, but Troika hits it with a very, very hard yes. So for both of you, and Maria, talking about your Knave stuff or just indie hack stuff, and I'll start with Maria this time. When you're looking at a system to hack, what are you kind of looking for as your starting place system? I know, like, when I started the Beyond the Wall project, I committed to Beyond the Wall because I brought it up. But also I was really looking to start with playbooks and scenario packs. I thought that was a good place to sort of start sort of constructing these lives that were sort of built out of individual events and sort of form the characters. And I also really kind of like the very non-Vancian magic system that Vancian magic is that old school AD&D magic where you're a first level wizard, you get one spell a day, and no matter what it was, you prepared that one spell. They had something a little different, a little more inspired by kind of later games and also kind of by the genre. So there were some cool rituals. But as Maria mentions, it's there's certainly things that some people don't resonate with about the system. So those are the two things I was looking for. Maria, when you pick up Knave, when you gravitate towards Knave or you gravitate to Troika or some other system, what are you kind of looking for? What are kind of when you start hacking, what are you kind of looking for as a sort of a base system when you've started those projects?
So for me, I want a simple yet workable base.
Mm-hmm.
Navy is a simple yet workable base.
Awesome.
Troika is also a simple yet workable base. And we have questions already, but I'll let Kyle.
Yeah, let's finish that and then I'll switch over to Kyle, and then we'll get a couple of questions from the group and see where those take us. So Kyle, when you start hacking, sort of what are you sort of looking for as kind of like your base system? What are you kind of looking for? And Maria, yeah, Troika is surprisingly simple for a almost 100-page game. So
yes, it is indeed. I think for myself, I really like some good tables. I really like some interesting, use of like risk dice. I love risk dice or usage dice, I think they're also called. Yeah. And I also like, as you were mentioning about Troika and what I've experienced with Wodu, a simple class or background system that allows you to just kind of do that thing you were mentioning of like sitting down and kind of just riffing on stuff and throwing together an interesting character concept in a box kind of thing, right? I loved it. Like on my YouTube stream, I sometimes just sit there and design Modu classes because it's just so much fun. So in the case of Macchiato Monsters, which is I guess one of the games I've hacked the most, it was really the interesting tables and the risk dice that grabbed me. And like the fact that risk dice were just used like everywhere, I was like, okay, yeah, this is real cool.
That itself was a hack of David Black's Black Hack, and just sort of grabbing that and sort of taking it to a new level. So that's really awesome. So I want to hit our first kind of question from the audience, which is from Jesse. So Jesse asked, I'm going to read the question and then sort of like we can kind of hash it out. Are there design goals that are unique to the OSR, or particular design goals that the OSR is exceptionally good for? That is to say, when you have a game concept with a certain kind of gameplay or theming or whatever as a goal, what makes you say, oh, this is a job for OSR style mechanics? And I'll take a swing at it because I don't mean this flip, Jesse, because but I'm just gonna be kind of vulnerable and honest. I will try to apply OSR style mechanics to so many things that probably did not sort of jump out to anybody else and say that's an OSR kind of game, even though I love working with and playing so many different other kinds of games, because it's sort of it's the language my soul speaks, and also it's such an easy place for me as somebody who just gets bogged down easily and gets distracted easily to start sort of like putting things together. So there's so many OSR Lego pieces or blocks, and they fit so nicely together that it's a really, for me, it's a really fantastic way to ensure I get started and see a project through to completion. And that's kind of part of the on the personal level, part of the answer, but also I think anything that hits some of the things that I think that OSR games do well, which is dealing with mortality, not only just in like, oh, we're grieving a loss of a friend, but also just creating very fragile characters and kind of thinking through what are the narrative or adventure or scenario design results of fragility, and also thinking through some of the things that I think especially BXD&D introduced lots of long years ago and are still they're not the cutting edge of tech, but there's still some solid, reliable tech, which is reaction rolls. BXD&D sort of introduced the notion of reactions, and the fact that like every time you meet something that's designated a monster does not mean it's necessarily surging forward to kill you. So I think anything that kind of hits some of those early themes, especially the ones that kind of got lost in the shuffle of game design over the years, that are interesting to sort of dig out of old games or even some of the new OSR games, and made me go like, oh, well, what if we use resource die or something like a resource die or a usage die for reactions or for relationships or for sort of storing up energy in a sense narratively in the trust of NPCs or some of those. So looking for some of that tech and seeing if some of that tech can apply to some of the things I want to do sort of hits me like, oh, and really, I'm going to be bluntly honest. If I'm designing, it's probably going to be OSR, just because what I said in the beginning. It's a strong place for me to start. With that, I'm going to pass it to Maria and get your take on this question.
So first of all, dreams for thinking of risk die in like relationships, because oh my god, my heart. But for me, I think it's less OSR mechanics are less OSR mechanics and more like random mechanics. Like I would imagine that, for example, risk die doesn't have to be OSR necessarily. Or for example, I tweeted about this in about Nave and how HP scales but damage doesn't. So I was thinking, oh hey, maybe I could use the Frey die from Godbound because that could work. And Lowell actually said, why don't you use escalation die? And I'm like, oh hey, that could work as well. So it's more like I would see them less as OSR specific and more like bits of mechanics that could mesh well together or could like function in sync.
Yeah, and I think that brings up something that it doesn't have to be labeled OSR to be workable with sort of a D20 based system, or to be importable to something that's supposed to emulate a D20 based system like World of Dungeons or Maze Wrath or something like that. Kyle, over to you.
Yeah, I think the number one thing for me when I think about hacking making a game and putting it in the OSR style is this idea of like openness. I think OSR games are very good at creating a sense of open space, which is ironic because a lot of them take place in dungeons, which are all about claustrophobic space. But there's a very sort of like open sense to the design process, open sense to character creation, to the point that you might just create a character from some random tables and then assemble in your mind some kind of plausible connections between these things. And so that's really the thing for me. So for example, when I started working on All Systems Nominal, the reason why I went with an OSR system was because I wanted to have a lot of intercompatibility with different sort of specific takes on the mecha genre. And that kind of intercompatibility or like modularity is a thing that you might think of in terms of tinkering, but you can also think about it in terms of like openness. And that was the main appeal for me. So when I think about making an OSR style game, it's usually because I want something very open-ended.
Excuse me. So Rochelle asked, and hi Rochelle, it was great to have you in the game this afternoon. And what resources would you refer someone to who wants to better understand hacking and game mechanics? So I'm going to start and snake back, and I'm going to wuss out and start with Kyle.
If you're talking about the OSR, you definitely want to read the Principia Apocrypha. Mm-hmm. That is an excellent text. If as a reference text for like what are OSR design principles and how can you bring them together, you can find that online, and it is super helpful. I found it to be a great inspiration for writing To the Halls of the Stormlord. And then aside from that, I would just say like, just play an OSR game because. Oh
my God, Kyle, you just stole my answer. I'm salty.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, you will inevitably hack an OSR game if you play an OSR game. So it's very much a learn by doing kind of deal.
Maria, I'm gonna pass it over to you real quick.
So let me elaborate on that. Just play is so important in any game design, not just OSR. Like playing a game is better than just theory crafting, and I will tell you by experience that playing a game is better than theory crafting. Just play more games, period.
So Rochelle, I would say that one thing is I think a good thing to do is find an OSR system that sort of interests you, and then another OSR system that interests you, and start sort of looking at where you would decouple one thing and import it into the other. For instance, and this is speaking strictly to my interest entirely, and I apologize for that because it may not be a helpful illustration, but like taking the Lamentation of the Flame Princess, and it's one of its most famous contributions is that batshit crazy summon spell, with which it's a first level spell. Almost anyone and their dog can cast it, and it's a small chance that the spell will actually destroy reality. which is so you may want to just kind of grab that. My friend Ben Loy, I was just chatting with, and I ran sort of a homebrewed OSR system this summer when our group was sort of half on a break and we didn't have good commitment. We wanted something sort of low impact. And during one session, he just stuck the Lamentations of the Flame Princess summon spell on an artifact and tricked people into reading it, essentially. I mean, it was much more narratively satisfying than trick people into reading it, but rolled on some tables, and then the world shifted around the characters, and they had to, this thing that they thought they were going to spend most of the session doing, looking for this one artifact for their employers, they spent trying to restore the world to kind of its rightful place. So Ben, brilliant. But also I think that's a good place to just start with kind of hacking. And I don't want to dodge your question, but I think in a sense, there's a lot of us just started looking at things we enjoyed in play and wondering how we could grab a piece of one system and stick it onto another system. And that includes genre. That includes like, how do I take this like fantastic thing I really love about Blue Rose and take it into a simpler set of mechanics? And then the OSR would be like, a great place for a simple set of mechanics. I think one thing about that, as Maria pointed out, is characters are going to be a little bit fragile in the OSR, and thematically that can be very satisfying for me. But just grab that Blue Rose setting thing you really love and sort of tack it onto an OSR system and see, and keep massaging and keep trying. And also buy your home group food so that if a rule doesn't work, they won't get mad at you. I think that's if you want to understand hacking and game mechanics, especially in that DIY hacking sense, having players who are just willing to sort of roll with it and see how things go and talk to you kindly but honestly. And that kind but honest is something that I think everybody in the Gauntlet would say is really important. Kindly but honestly about what's working and what they'd like to see a little bit more of. And a second question from Rochelle. OSR is appealing to use to run games for kids. Are there system mechanics where you feel that would enable that even better? And I think the three of us are not great running with kids people, but I will tell you, I think if you're going to do kind of a low character, and I'll pass this off to everybody else too. If you're going to do a low character fragility game, I think starting with something like the Beyond the Wall playbooks, which you can grab a lot of those for free on the internet just to kind of see how they work. And you could even sort of port them over to D&D 5th edition with some massaging and shifting things around. The ability to edit PDFs is the best $30 piece of technology I've ever purchased. And you can almost not tell where I edited it and where the PDF was, original PDF was. But I think having that playbook where they're just sort of building their backstory as they go would be really interesting and kind of gets kids excited. And then maybe looking for some, I think one of the things that young players found unsatisfying about the OSR back when I was playing, and that I know that reading actual D&D designers were not running, their home groups were way more gonzo than the rules that got on the page, is finding some simple ways, whether it's World of Dungeons or some playbooks in Beyond the Wall, like the Bear playbook, to add some like gonzo character concepts to the mix. And not have everybody be a gonzo character necessarily, but add some of those crazy things that only kids will think of. And I think there's certainly some text in OSR out there. James Spahn writes lots of wonderful, crazy, simple classes that fit with swords and wizardry that you could hack pretty easily. And I'm taking all of everybody else's time. So I'm going to pass this over to Maria.
So it's interesting that you mentioned Beyond the Wall and Fifth Edition. Yeah. Well, because it ties into Beyond the Wall and Knave, because Knave, as far as I recall, was created because Ben Milton runs for kids in 5th grade. So he wanted a really simple system for whatever that age is, and Knave works, Maze Rats works. I think the simplicity. Well, it also depends on how old your kids are, or not necessarily your kids, but like the kids you're running for are, and what they're interested in. I think Knave works for that, but then again, I'm biased. As long as you're not running Lamentation stuff, I'm cool with it. So yeah.
Yeah, I think definitely having that genre fit and things that fit with what kids are interested in would be great. And then over to Kyle.
Yeah, so this is a little bit difficult for me to answer because I have done quite a bit of work with kids in my job. Like I've tutored like middle schoolers, young middle schoolers. I've worked in kindergartens, but I live in Japan, and the language barrier makes using RPGs an impossibility unless I'm going to just do everything in Japanese, but I'm usually hired to teach English, so it doesn't really work out. I've tried to do it with university students, but it still doesn't work out. So I would say my instinct here would probably be to like make up some random generation tables aimed towards kids. So like, a lot of these random generation tables you get from like Funnel World or something are like, they have a lot of sort of esoteric medieval terms in them, and that's just not going to be very useful for dealing with kids. But if you curate your own list of comprehensible things and like maybe, add some pictures in there to make it easier to understand, that could definitely create some of the gonzo-ness that Richard was mentioning there, and I'm sure that would be fun.
I grabbed onto some of that both from Ben's earlier game, Maze Rats, and then I've not read Knave yet. I bought a copy, and then Beyond the Wall in Dark Designs and Verdigris, where you're sort of randomly generating and answering questions about your character's background, and I think that's something that a lot of kids sort of resonate with is sort of like, oh my gosh, I've got to grab onto this sort of random thing about my character and figure out how to sort of embody that, and giving them some ways to opt out. I mean, just like adults, they like to opt out from things that just don't like them, but I think that and yeah, thank you, Rochelle. I think those random tables, like just, yeah, kids and adults alike get really excited when all of a sudden you give them a bunch of pieces and they have to form a story together from them. There's something that kind of grabs the mind that way. So, any more questions?
We have 10 minutes.
Okay.
Do you want to move on to the next part?
Yeah. So I think we've already hit on a lot of the things I had in this kind of in our script. If my co-panelists are willing to put up with my crazy idea, I would love to throw down 3d6 and see kind of what you guys would do with the couple of the ideas presented in our random OSR hack panel or hack table, and see what you would do with it. Is that okay? Is that something? Is that a thumbs up?
Let's lightning round. Let's see what we come up with in 10 minutes.
Okay. Gosh, I hope this works.
Wait, do you have a roll for your party?
I do not. I used the emergency dice.
Oh, cool.
On 2018, and here is what I have got: a romantic space. This is the OSR genre game we're going for. A romantic space game where you're all from the same. Where would you start with that idea? what system would you kind of pick to kind of as your starting base, and what about that system sort of appeals you, and what would you start sort of picking on? It's a romantic, both in the sense of, I think most of the quests would be very personal and about the personal lives of the characters. Also kissing, yes. RPGs with kissing. Maria and I are on this page together. Kyle, sorry, we're dragging you onto this.
I'm on board, believe me.
Yes. And set in space where you were all from the same monastery.
I'm gonna say that is a completely lit idea. I am totally on board with that idea, and I can't believe that it was randomly generated. So
this is how beautiful random generation tables are.
Yes.
I know, right?
So Maria, what would you start with? Is any system that you would just... Yes, Jedi in Love. Thank you.
Oh my God.
Yes.
I am unsure. I'm gonna pick a random system and say, hold up. Someone else go first because I have to think about this.
Kyle, what would you grab onto?
I think if it's a romance game, I would probably want to have a core that was fairly simple because there's not going to be a lot of resource management, that sort of thing. Probably don't need super extensive information for the characters in terms of their like equipment or anything like that. So I would probably go with something like Knave or Wodu to start with, and then just hack it like crazy. Hack it like, yeah, just go wild.
What would your starting place be, Maria? Have you thought of one?
Yeah, I actually was thinking about doing something similar in the gun now that I think about it. I would take Troika, and in the beginning, I've noticed that Troika and Dungeon World stats match up pretty closely. Like Troika stats are double that of Dungeon World, so I'm gonna take Space Marine versus Moonicorn, and then adapt those and make those backgrounds in Troika.
Yes. Yes. I think I might start with one of my favorite little games that doesn't get enough attention because it does not have a PDF version that's for sale, at least last time I checked, is White Hack. And I know that was a big influence on Fraser Simons when he did Veil 2020, kind of mashed up a lot of stuff from World of Dungeons and White Hack. And hey, Fraser, we love you. I think because it has kind of a simple kind of core 3-class structure, you could build a lot on. And you might even sort of hack that 3-class structure to do a more romantic fantasy kind of story. And that it borrows that 3-class structure straight out of sort of white box D&D, where there was a cleric, a wizard, and a fighter, or a fighting man in 70s sexist language. And it sort of goes with, you've got a
the strong, the deft, and the
wise. But one thing that I think is kind of forgotten in second edition, when people kind of rave about the 3-class structure, is he quietly added 2 additional classes. One called the Favored, which is very tied to NPCs and working with NPCs, and one called the Brave, which has a lot of strong narrative mechanics in it. And I might do sort of the Favored, the Brave, and the Strong, or the Favored, the Brave, and the Wise, as kind of a starting place for that, just because it kind of gives a mix of OSR and narrative pieces, but still kind of has those OSR interaction pieces. You know, it's still DM rolls, you roll kind of structure. And then I might borrow a few sort of player-facing pushes from the Macchiato monsters.
Yeah, I think it would definitely include some risk dice.
Yeah,
for sure. And I would also include like some random generation tables as to like what the backgrounds of the characters are and like what some previous like incidents where they met or spent time together were. And so then you have things to like refer back to. Yeah. Those are two ideas I have in this 10-minute hacking session.
Maria, anything else you want to add? And then we have a closing question from River, which is going to be the great dividing argument question where we'll all just flip our tables and storm off. Anything else you want to add?
Not particularly. You can find me on the Gauntlet Slack on Twitter. Awesome. Other than that, we can wrap up.
All right.
We don't have time for another workshop. We have 3 minutes.
River just asked if we could do another workshop.
Oh yeah.
I think River did ask a question: is Numenera or the cipher system OSR? And I think I think there's things that kind of separate it from a lot of the design principles of OSR. But I don't want to say this in a way that sounds disrespectful, but I was going to say is underwear. But you can say Moneycook's roots in 2nd edition AD&D, which were his first big job, I think still show through in his work on cipher system. And there's a lot of narrative stuff, but I've heard lots of people speak sort of glowingly about their ability to sort of grab old modules and just sort of adapt them sort of on the fly to the cipher system. So I think I don't think it's specifically refers to the OSR or wants to be necessarily in the OSR camp, but I think there's certainly some stuff there that is common roots and certainly stuff that's worth borrowing one from the other from. I will speak to Maria, who, if you have a closing thought, and then contact places that people can look for you.
Right, closing thought. Cipher system being OSR, it's like saying D&D 5th ed is OSR. But yeah, you can find me on the Gauntlet Slack. G+ is closing down, so I won't even bother. Twitter is @Thoobn, which is spelled THOOBN.
Awesome. Kyle, closing thought and any place people can find you.
I would say my closing thought is, oh boy, I think really, I think I would say we've presented one side of the story here, and I encourage you to go out and try hacking and see what the limitations of OSR are for you, right? Because we've presented a very glowing picture of it. I've had a lot of difficulties with hacking the OSR to do other genres, but I think it's a worthwhile endeavor. So give it a try, see what works and see what doesn't. That's kind of my feeling, because you never really know, right, until you try it. And it's easy to try because OSR is so hackable. All right, so my info, you can also find me on the Gauntlet Slack. I'm there all the time. And my Twitter is at Ygraph with them. It's trailing _. So it's WIEGRAF_. And you can also find me at my YouTube channel, which is Ygraph9009, which is WIEGRAF9009. And probably the most relevant thing you can find there is my series, Let's Learn Blades in the Dark. It's a very long video tutorial series covering all of the rules of Blades in the Dark, which has been fairly popular. And you can also track the development of my game, All Systems Nominal, at ASN RPG.
Great. I'm Richard, and you can find me on Gauntlet Slack. Maybe I might be on Discord a little more often. Discord and I are starting to get along a little bit better. And you can find me on Twitter at ARR_ROO. That's R_Roo, which is both because I love werewolves and because my first initial is R and my last name is Ruane. So it has been great to talk to you guys and get your questions. Thank you so much for being here and joining us at GauntletCon and giving me an excuse to talk to two of my favorite people. I hope to talk to all of y'all soon.